It was generally agreed in St. Mary Mead that no one arranged a village fete with quite the flair of Mrs. Caroline Ellsworth. The Women's Institute Bazaar, held that year in the gardens of Gossington Close, was therefore looked upon as something of a social triumph before it had even begun. The day was of that peculiarly English brightness that is never entirely to be trusted, a sharp blue sky, sunlight on polished tables, and beyond the clipped yews, clouds, already gathering like an afterthought. Miss Vicar's wife fretted about rain. The vicar fretted about the tombola, and Mrs. Ellsworth, tall and angular, presided over everything with a kind of brisk benevolence that made people both grateful and slightly afraid. On the far side of the lawn, near the rose pergola, Miss Jane Marple sat in a deck chair of faded striped canvas, her knitting needles flashing demurely in the light. She had been placed there quite deliberately by Mrs. Ellsworth, who had the firm conviction that elderly ladies ought not to be overexcited. Miss Marple, who had witnessed more human excitement than Mrs. Ellsworth could ever imagine, appeared resigned to her exile and watched the comings and goings with her mild, bird-like eyes. There was much to observe. Young Tom Ellsworth, Caroline's nephew, stood by the coconuts shy, looking rather more interested in the profits than in the coconuts. Beside him hovered pretty, anxious Lydia Marsh, the schoolmistress, whose hand he took whenever he thought no one was looking, and let go of whenever he suspected they were. Old Major Burke, with his red face and his even redder nose, was already complaining that the beer tent was criminally inaccessible. The vicar's daughter, Alice, fluttered from stall to stall like a nervous white moth, her gaze constantly returning to the fortune-telling tent in the corner. "Palms read by Madame Zara," announced the painted board outside that tent. St. Mary Mead, being a respectable village, knew perfectly well that Madame Zara was in fact Mrs. Martha Price from Oldie Mill Lane, lately returned from a long sojourn abroad with peculiar ideas about Eastern wisdom. That did not stop nearly everyone from feeling faintly thrilled and, in some cases, faintly uneasy. "Palm reading," sniffed Mrs. Ellsworth to the vicar's wife. "Nonsense, of course, but it draws people, and we must think of the takings." Miss Marple, hearing this, counted on her needles and did not comment. She merely noted, as she often did, who went into the tent and what expression they wore when they emerged. It was after Madame Zara had read the vicar's palm, to the barely concealed scandal of his wife, after young Lydia had gone in giggling and come out pale, and after Major Burke had emerged scoffing rather too loudly, that the first faint crack in the day appeared. Alice, the vicar's daughter, slipped into the tent. No one seemed to notice, except Miss Marple, who always noticed shy girls doing things they were not quite supposed to do. Time passed, people queued, chatted, laughed. Mrs. Ellsworth berated a small boy over a damaged cake. A dog stole a sausage. Clouds thickened. The fortune-teller's curtain stirred occasionally. Then someone observed, in the casual, thoughtless way of such afternoons, "Funny, Alice has been in there a long time, hasn't she?" The remark once made seemed to ripple outward. Heads turned, voices called lightly, then more loudly. "Alice? Alice, dear." Mrs. Ellsworth, annoyed at the disruption, strode across the grass and swept aside the curtain with an impatient hand. Her shriek, sharp and high, tore through the garden like a rent in fabric. Miss Marple was already rising from her chair as people ran. In the dim, perfumed gloom of the tent, on a low chair strewn with gaudy scarves, sat Alice. Her fair head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes stared at nothing. Upon her pale throat, just visible above the lace collar of her dress, was the unmistakable livid mark of a thumb. The fete at Gossington Close had acquired, quite suddenly, a great deal more excitement than even Mrs. Ellsworth had intended. They found her in the late Mr. Hartwell's study, exactly as Miss Marple had expected they would. The door, usually locked, now stood half open, one hinge protesting with a faint creak as the vicar pushed it wider. The room smelt faintly of cigar smoke and old leather, with the heavy curtains half drawn against the afternoon glare. The guests, pressing forward in morbid curiosity, were held back by an instinctive respect for the threshold of death. Mrs. Hartwell lay sprawled on the Persian rug before the great mahogany desk. One hand still clutched the edge of it, as though she had tried to steady herself in that last instant. Her pearl necklace, so recently twisted between nervous fingers, was broken, white beads scattered like tiny bones across the carpet. It was not, however, the pearls that caused the ladies to gasp and clutch at one another. A silver paper knife, ornate and old-fashioned, protruded from just below her left breast, its handle engraved with the Hartwell crest. A single dark stain had spread across the bodice of her dove-gray silk dress. "Stand back, please," Dr. Haydock said sharply, dropping to one knee. He made the customary motions, a hand at the wrist, an ear bent close, but his expression was already set. "I'm afraid there is nothing to be done." Derek shouldered his way in. "Constance!" he shouted, the name coming out hoarse, almost unbelieving. For an instant his face was naked, vulnerable, as if some solid ground had been wrenched away beneath him. Then his features rearranged themselves into a more acceptable grief. Who could have done this?" "A dreadful accident," murmured Mrs. Price Ridley from the doorway, already shaping events to fit her sensibilities. "She must have fallen. People do not usually fall onto paper knives," Miss Marple observed mildly. From the second rank of onlookers, she did not raise her voice. Nevertheless, those nearest heard her, and several turned to stare. She appeared quite harmless, a frail old lady in a sensible hat, yet her pale eyes were very bright. Inspector Craddock arrived from Much Benham with commendable speed, summoned by the vicar's boy on his bicycle. By the time he reached the study, the body had been covered with a shawl. The guests shepherded back to the garden, and Mrs. Hartwell's maid was weeping noisily in the corridor. Miss Marple, who had quietly installed herself in a high-backed chair against the wall, watched the inspector with gentle approval. She liked Inspector Craddock. He listened. "A nasty business, this," he said after a brief examination of the scene. "No sign of a struggle. Nothing stolen as far as you can see, Doctor?" "Nothing obvious," replied Dr. Haydock. "But then, there is rather a lot here to be stolen." The walls were lined with bookcases, heavy with law books and leather-bound volume. The desk itself was immaculately tidy. A silver inkstand, a calendar, a sheaf of papers in a neat pile, and an envelope lying face down near the blotter. Miss Marple's gaze rested for a moment on that envelope. It seemed oddly out of place, as though it had been put there in a hurry. Inspector Craddock followed her glance quite by accident. "We'll have that later," he muttered to the constable, who carefully slid it into an evidence bag. In the garden, the atmosphere had changed from festivity to a buzzing, appalled excitement. Small knots of people had formed. By the tea table, near the croquet hoops, under the willow tree where Miss Marple had been sitting. The same phrases were repeated with minor variations, like a village chorus. "Murder, at Willowmere, of all places. Who would want to harm poor Mrs. Hartwell? Of course, there is the will tomorrow. Derek will be ruined if there's any scandal. What about that nephew from London? It's always the quiet ones. You mark my words." Miss Marple, rejoining them, heard everything and appeared to hear nothing. She accepted a fresh cup of tea from the vicar's wife and sipped it thoughtfully. Murder, like illness, brought out very particular traits in people. And human nature, she knew, did not vary nearly as much as people supposed. Her mind, quite without effort, began matching faces to memories of other small scandals in other villages. Of wills altered, of second marriages resented, of fortunes anxiously awaited. Somewhere, in all this very ordinary human emotion, lay the one small, crucial deviation that marked out the murderer. It was nearly an hour before Constable Polk arrived, puffing and red-faced, followed by Inspector Craddock from Much Benham, who had been called away from a quiet Sunday tea. By then, the guests had been shepherded back onto the lawn, the more hysterical among them pacified with strong tea, the promise that statements would be taken in due course. Miss Marple had withdrawn to her original seat beneath the willow, her knitting once more in her hands, though her needles remained still. From where she sat, she could hear the low murmur of conversation that hummed like bees over a clover patch. "Poison, they say." Mrs. Price Ridley announced importantly to anyone who would listen. "In her sherry, and only think, served in her own study. It stands to reason that whoever handed it to her must be the guilty party, one of the family, no doubt. Or perhaps the doctor," suggested Miss Hartnell darkly, "always hanging about with his bottles and things." "Rubbish," snapped the vicar's wife, shocked. Haydock has attended this village for 20 years. Besides, he was with us the entire afternoon." "All the more convenient," Mrs. Price Ridley persisted. "Nobody ever suspects the doctor." Miss Marple did not interject. She simply watched as Inspector Craddock emerged from the house, his expression thoughtful. He conferred briefly with Constable Polk, then raised his voice. "If you please, ladies and gentlemen, I must ask that no one leaves Willowmere House until I have taken your names and addresses. This is now a police matter of the gravest sort." A murmur of uneasy assent passed through the crowd. Several of the guests looked as though they had been personally affronted by this suggestion that they might be implicated in something as vulgar as murder. Derek Hartwell stepped forward with a kind of restless energy. "Inspector, this is all quite ghastly. My stepmother was not a robust woman. Couldn't this have been some sort of tragic accident? She might have mistaken a bottle." Craddock regarded him steadily. "The doctor is of the opinion that we are dealing with cyanide, Mr. Hartwell. One does not ordinarily keep such a substance in the sherry decanter." Sarah, who stood close by, spoke in a strained voice. "Is there any possibility that my mother might have done this to herself?" "A very understandable question," Craddock said, not unkindly, "but it is far too early to draw conclusions." Miss Marple's needles clicked again, gently. People were so very predictable, she reflected. In St. Mary Mead, unhappy events were never simply allowed to be tragic. They must be explained, apportioned, and, if possible, assigned to a suitable villain. It was nearly dusk when the last of the guests were permitted to leave, having given their brief and largely unhelpful accounts. The vicar and his wife offered to escort Miss Marple home, but she declined with a small smile. "I think I shall take the long way through the high street," she said. "Fresh air is so very beneficial after disturbances." In truth, she wished to observe. Already, windows were being flung open, and curtains twitched as villagers leaned out to exchange tidings. At the butcher's, Mr. Sims was telling an appreciative audience that he had always considered Willowmere an unlucky sort of house. Outside the post office, Miss Hartnell recounted with increasing embellishment how she had noticed Mrs. Hartwell's uneasy air from the very beginning. By the time Miss Marple reached her neat little cottage, word of Constance Hartwell's dramatic death had spread through St. Mary Mead like ink through blotting paper. Kettle on, curtains half drawn, she allowed herself a small sigh. A locked room, a convenient will dispute, a respected doctor, an idle stepson, an anxious daughter, and a study with a freshly used fireplace. Such a comfortable, familiar pattern. And yet, as she poured hot water over the tea leaves, Miss Marple felt a tiny prickle of unease. It was all, if anything, a little too neat. Human beings, in her long experience, rarely arranged their wickedness so tidily. When they attempted to, some small thing always went astray. Her gaze drifted to the framed photograph of her nephew Raymond on the mantelpiece, and she recalled a certain affair in Stonygates involving another clever arrangement that had missed perfection by the narrowest of margins. "The 99% perfect crime," she murmured to herself. And such things do have a way of happening again. By early evening, Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham, his motorcar drawing a cluster of onlookers to the gate. He stepped into Willowmere House with an air of brusque efficiency, nodding curtly to Constable Polk before turning keen grey eyes upon the assembled household. Locked room, suspected poison, prominent local figure, he said, almost with relish. We shall do this by the book, Polk. The body is to remain where it is until the police surgeon arrives. No one is to leave the premises. Derek bristled. Really, Inspector, is that necessary? My stepmother was clearly distressed. She could have taken it herself. Inspector Slack regarded him coolly. Suicide is one possibility, Mr. Hartwell. But cyanide is not something one usually keeps in the medicine cupboard, is it? Until we know where it came from and how it got into that glass, we shall assume nothing. Miss Marple watched him with the faintest suggestion of approval. For all his bluster, Slack was not a fool. He simply liked matters simple, and murder, in Miss Marple's experience, rarely obliged. The guests had been gently but firmly ushered out, sent home in a flurry of shocked whispers and half-formed theories. By 7 o'clock, only the family, essential staff, and a few lingering busybodies, among whom Miss Marple would have indignantly declined to be counted, remained at Willowmere. Inspector Slack began with the study, moving slowly around the room, his notebook open. He paused at the fireplace, frowning at the fresh ash. What's been burned here so recently, then? Sarah swallowed. Mother kept old documents there sometimes. Perhaps she was tidying up, or destroying something inconvenient, Derek muttered. She knew the solicitors had found grounds to challenge the will. She may have panicked. Mr. Hartwell, Slack said sharply, we'll have less speculation and more information. Did either of you know your stepmother to have access to cyanide? There was a brief pause. Then a quiet voice from the doorway said, If I might, Inspector. Everyone turned to see Mr. Graves, the Hartwells' butler, standing with his usual grave dignity. He was an austere man of about 50, with a lined face and eyes that missed very little. In the potting shed, sir, he continued, there is a small quantity of potassium cyanide. It was kept, for some years now, for the destruction of wasps' nests and other pests. Mr. Hartwell Sr. was very particular about such things. The bottle is kept locked in a tin box on the upper shelf. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened. Show me. They crossed the back corridor, Miss Marple ambling along behind, apparently intent on not being underfoot. In the potting shed, the air was damp and earthy. Mr. Graves reached up to an old biscuit tin on the high shelf, took a key from his watch chain, and opened it. See, inside, nestled among garden twine and an old pair of secateurs, was a small brown bottle, stoppered and neatly labeled. Potassium cyanide. Poison. Slack lifted it gingerly. The cork was firm, but faintly stained around the edge, as though it had been removed recently. He examined the neck of the bottle, then the tin itself. Who has access to this key? He demanded. I do, sir, Graves replied, and Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, has the duplicate, though she rarely has need of it. Mrs. Finch is in the kitchen, I suppose, Slack said. We'll speak to her shortly. For now, no one is to touch this bottle or this box. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the narrow shed. And if anyone here has been in this shed today, I strongly suggest they mention it now. There was a silence, heavy and significant. Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime observing the way people reacted under sudden scrutiny, noted the nearly imperceptible shift of Derek's weight, the quick flick of Sarah's eyes toward the door, and, most intriguing of all, the way Mr. Graves's normally steady hands tightened fractionally on the edge of the workbench. It was, she reflected, very much like the time old Mrs. Partridge's jam cupboard had been raided in St. Mary Mead. Everyone swore they had not been near it, yet 3 sets of sticky fingerprints had told quite a different story. The news that Mrs. Hartwell had been poisoned at her own garden party spread through St. Mary Mead with astonishing speed, borne on the invisible yet efficient currents of village communication. By the following morning, every respectable breakfast table was set not only with toast and marmalade, but with theories, elaborate, confidently stated, and mostly quite wrong. At the Blue Boar, Mr. and Mrs. Price Ridley held court over kippers, declaring it quite obvious that Mrs. Hartwell had taken her own life rather than face the shame of a contested win at the grocer's. Mrs. Perkins announced that Derek had always had a wild look about him, and that one couldn't expect much else from a man who had once been sent down from Oxford. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Mrs. Clement worried aloud that poor Constance might have been blackmailed over some dreadful secret, while her husband murmured something about judgment and the inscrutability of Providence. Miss Marple, having taken her customary light breakfast of porridge and tea, sat by her cottage window with her knitting, listening to the robins quarrelling in the hedge and reflecting upon the peculiar tidiness of the affair. Locked rooms and conveniently labelled poison were all very well in novels, but in real life they often signalled something rather more contrived. She was not surprised 2 hours later when a firm knock sounded at her front door and Constable Polk appeared cap in hand, looking both apologetic and faintly hopeful. Inspector Slack thought as you might be willing to. That is, seeing as you were present at Willowmere yesterday, he began awkwardly. Miss Marple smiled. Of course, Constable. Do sit down. I expect the inspector has decided Derek Hartwell must be the guilty party. Polk looked startled. Well, ma'am, he does seem to have the strongest motive. Quarrelling over the will, access to the garden, knowing the household arrangements. And there's that bottle in the potting shed. Inspector says it almost amounts to an open and shut case. Almost, Miss Marple repeated softly. Such a dangerous word. Almost. I recall a case in Littlehampton where everything appeared perfectly straightforward. A husband, a life insurance policy, and a most unfortunate boating accident. Only it turned out the dear lady had quite different ideas about whom she wished to benefit. Constable Polk shifted uneasily. You don't think Master Derek did it, then? I think, Miss Marple said, her eyes distant, that when something looks very nearly perfect, one must ask oneself who arranged it so. Real murders are generally clumsy, you know. People act in haste, forgetting the small things, but here we have an ideal source of poison, a locked room, and a quarrelsome heir. One might almost believe the situation had been prepared for Inspector Slack, like a tray of cold meats. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked up the lane to Willowmere, under the pretext of delivering a jar of her rose-hip jelly to Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper. The great house had taken on the muffled, tentative air of a place in mourning, with blinds half drawn and footsteps softened on carpets. Mrs. Finch, a plump woman with reddened eyes and flour on her hands, accepted the jelly with obvious gratitude. It's very kind of you, Miss Marple. Everything's in such an uproar. Inspector Slack's been up and down the servants' stairs asking who was where and when, as if we'd any time for skulking about during a garden party. Teacups and sandwich trays enough to drive a body mad. Of course, Miss Marple soothed. Still, one does forget the odd thing under such pressure. I always say housework and crime rarely mix well. The timing never quite works out. Mrs. Finch gave a watery chuckle. True enough. Why, only yesterday I was that flustered I near forgot to send Lily out with the extra napkins before Mrs. Hartwell went to fetch the raffle prizes. Poor soul. Lily? Miss Marple's tone was mild. She would be the new parlour maid, I suppose. Such a sweet-looking girl with her fair hair and that little dimple. That's the one. Came to us from a place in Much Benham 6 months ago. Mrs. Hartwell trusted her, she did. Sent her to dust the study in the mornings, even. Not that Lily was anywhere near there yesterday when it happened, mind you. She was in the back corridor taking a tray to the morning room. At least that's what she told the inspector. A back corridor can be so very convenient, Miss Marple observed gently, for those who wish to go unnoticed. I wonder, Mrs. Finch, would Lily be free for a moment? I'd so like to tell her how very nicely she carried that silver tea service yesterday. One does notice these things. And as Mrs. Finch hurried off in search of the parlour-maid, Miss Marple allowed herself a small inward nod. For in her long acquaintance with human frailty, she had learned that it was rarely the obvious quarrels, but the quiet, seemingly loyal attachments that concealed the most dangerous secrets. Miss Marple turned the chemist's receipt over once more, her lips pursed in a thoughtful line. Photographic chemicals. Sarah Hartwell's neat signature. Derek's pocket. It was, she reflected, just the sort of untidy arrangement that occurred when people were not quite telling the truth, but had not yet decided which particular lie they intended to live with. She slipped on her hat and decided that an old lady could hardly be blamed for paying a condolence call. At Willowmere, the blinds were respectfully half-drawn. Sarah received Miss Marple in the small sitting room that looked onto the herb garden, its usual prettiness marred now by an air of uncertainty. Sarah's eyes were reddened but alert, her dark hair pulled back more severely than usual. "Miss Marple, you are kind," she said, managing a wan smile. "Everything feels rather unreal. Mother was difficult, yes, but this... I keep expecting her to stride in and complain about the draft." "Shock is a very numbing thing, my dear," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chintz-covered armchair. Her needles emerged, delicate steel glinting against the soft wool. "I won't trouble you long. I only wondered how you were bearing up, with the inspector's questions and all." Sarah gave a brittle little laugh. "Inspector Slack seems quite determined to hang Derek on the nearest convenient tree. I suppose it makes matters simple for him. A quarrelsome stepson, money at stake, story neatly tied up with string. Life is rarely so tidily arranged, in my experience," Miss Marple said mildly. "You and your stepbrother have not always been close, I think, but grief can be a curious unifier." "Close?" Something flashed in Sarah's expression. Resentment, quickly masked. "Derek gambled away most of his allowance years ago. Mother paid his debts. Once. After father died, she refused to do it again. He never forgave her. And now this business with the will. If father truly changed it in her favor, Derek stands to lose almost everything." Miss Marple's needles clicked a little faster. "And you, my dear?" "Oh, I'm the dutiful daughter," Sarah said with a bitterness that surprised even herself. "A modest annuity, a few family pieces, enough to be respectable, not enough to be independent." A little silence fell, broken only by the distant clink of china in the kitchen. Miss Marple let it stretch, knowing that quiet often coaxed out truths bolder questioning never reached. "You have a dark room here, I believe," she said at last, as if the thought had just occurred to her. "Such a fascinating hobby. Photography. One hears it requires quite special chemicals." Sarah stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yes. Father converted a small room off the back corridor. I mostly do landscapes and some portraits for the village fete. Why do you ask?" "Oh, only that I once knew a young man who was quite careless with his photographic solutions," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "He thought labels were an unnecessary formality, until his landlady used the wrong bottle to clean a brass kettle." Quite a commotion. Fortunately, she smelled the odd odor in time. There was that fleeting pause again, a fraction too long before Sarah answered. "Everything is clearly marked in my darkroom, I assure you." Miss Marple let the matter drop outwardly, but inwardly she noted the tightening of Sarah's fingers around her handkerchief and the faint chemical stain at the edge of her right thumbnail, as if something had been recently scrubbed away. When she left a few minutes later, she encountered Mr. Graves in the hall, his usually impassive features troubled. "If I might say so, Miss Marple," he murmured quietly, glancing toward the staircase. "Things are not as simple here as the inspector believes. Mrs. Hartwell had other concerns of late, matters she did not wish discussed." "Other concerns, Mr. Graves?" The butler hesitated, then bent closer. "Yesterday morning, the post brought a letter that distressed her greatly, not from the solicitors, foreign stamp. She took it straight to the study, and not 10 minutes later I smelled burning paper from under the door." "Foreign," Miss Marple repeated softly. "How very interesting. Was the country by any chance Switzerland? Mr. Graves looked startled. Why, yes, madame, but how could you possibly— Miss Marple only smiled, though her mind had already leapt ahead to another villager, another quiet habit, and a certain retired colonel who received medical brochures from Zurich more often than seemed entirely natural. Miss Marple left the conservatory, with the air of someone who had merely offered a little comfort and received a confidence in return. Only the slight tightening of her lips betrayed the fact that serious revelations had shifted the pattern of the case quite markedly in her mind. In the hall, she encountered Inspector Slack, who had just emerged from the study with a folder of documents under his arm and an air of grim satisfaction. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, not unkindly. "You do get about. No doubt you've heard the latest. The bank manager from Much Benham has just been over." He lowered his voice. "Our Mr. Derrick has been drawing on his account rather heavily. Overdraft, loans, even a discreet attempt at selling some of the more portable heirlooms, quietly, through a London dealer." "That does sound serious," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "And yet, if he hoped to benefit from Mrs. Hartwell's death, wouldn't he have waited until the will dispute was settled? Challenging a will is such a time-consuming business. People who commit murder for money are generally impatient, I've noticed. They like to see the result rather more quickly." Slack sniffed. "Greedy people aren't always clever, but I'm about to make things a good deal clearer." He tapped the folder. "I've found letters between Derrick and his solicitors about contesting the will. Yes, but also a note from Mrs. Hartwell herself, sent to the same firm, withdrawing an earlier intention to make a generous settlement on her stepson. It's dated last week. If Derrick knew about that, the motive becomes very strong indeed." "One always does wonder who delivered such letters to the post," Miss Marple murmured. "Households can be remarkably leaky vessels where information is concerned." Following her own train of thought, she walked slowly toward the study, now carefully cordoned off with a length of string that Constable Polk had produced from somewhere about his person. The policeman, who held Miss Marple in a respect to which he would never admit, stepped aside to let her glance in. The room remained as she remembered, the mahogany desk with its scattered papers, the overturned sherry glass, the open wooden box that had contained the solicitor's letter. But now, with the clarity of hindsight, certain details stood out more sharply. The bell pull, just beyond Mrs. Hartwell's lifeless hand. The chair, drawn out slightly from its usual place, as though someone had recently sat opposite her. And the faint singe marks on the grate, suggesting that not all of what had been burned that afternoon was mere correspondence. As she studied the room, Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway, carrying a feather duster. "Inspector Slack said I wasn't to touch anything in here, Miss Marple, but he did permit me to bring this to you." Wimp extended a small envelope. "We found it slipped under the kitchen door this morning. No stamp, no name on the front, just for the police." Miss Marple opened it with nimble fingers. Inside was a single sheet of cheap notepaper, bearing a brief, clumsily printed message in block capitals. "You are looking at the wrong man. The doctor knows more than he says." No signature, of course. No distinguishing mark. Slack, when shown the note, only grunted. "Crank," he declared. "Anonymous letters always turn up in a village when there's been a death. Malice, spite, mischief? Take your pick. Dr. Haydock is a respected man. He was with the body, not with the poison." "But the two positions," Miss Marple said gently, "are not always mutually exclusive." That evening, as darkness settled over St. Mary Mead, events took a sharp and disturbing turn. At 9:30, just as Miss Marple was preparing for bed, there came a frantic knocking at her cottage door. It was young Mr. Polk, breathless and wide-eyed. "Miss Marple, begging your pardon, ma'am, but there's been another incident at Willowmere. Miss Sarah," he swallowed. "They think she's tried to take her own life." Miss Marple reached for her shawl. "Take me there at once, Constable," she said quietly. I have an idea this second tragedy may tell us more about the first than anyone presently suspects. Inspector Slack returned to Willowmere that afternoon with the anonymous note folded neatly in his breast pocket and a deepening furrow between his brows. The postmistress, when questioned, had confirmed Miss Marple's quiet suspicions. Several registered letters had arrived for Mrs. Hartwell over the past month, all bearing the crest of Messrs. Wickham and Brent. One, however, had come from a different London address, an investigative agency known discreetly for tracing inconvenient secrets. Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, was growing visibly restless when Slack arrived at his surgery. The doctor was pacing his waiting room, his usual professional calm replaced by a brittle impatience. "If this is about Constance again, Inspector, I've told you everything I know," he said sharply. "She was poisoned with cyanide, which you kindly confirmed by sending the sherry glass to the lab. The verdict is murder. Surely your energies would be better spent on the family." "Strange you should mention the lab," Slack replied coolly. "Because we've had word from another establishment in London. Parcel addressed to you arrived from a chemical supplier 2 days before the garden party, containing small quantities of various compounds, including potassium cyanide, ostensibly for research purposes." Haydock's face flushed a slow, dangerous red. "I'm a medical man, Inspector. I conduct occasional experiments, yes, but never with malicious intent. My position requires access to certain substances." "Your gambling debts also require funding," Slack said, fixing him with a sharp stare. "Mrs. Hartwell was threatening to expose those debts, wasn't she? Break off your relationship, possibly even report your conduct to the medical council." For a moment, the doctor's composure cracked. "She overreacted. Constance was under pressure. From Derek, from Sarah, from that interminable will business. She was frightened, cornered. She lashed out." "Interesting," Slack murmured, "because anonymous letters have been doing a great deal of lashing out lately as well." While this confrontation unfolded, Miss Marple paid a second visit to Mrs. Finch, ostensibly to discuss funeral arrangements, but in reality pursuing a detail that had been troubling her: the burned letters in the study fireplace. "After you found the body, Mrs. Finch," she asked gently, "did you notice whether anything remained in the grate? Sometimes corners of paper escape the flames, especially if the burning was hurried." Mrs. Finch hesitated. "I did see a fragment, Miss Marple. Just one lodged behind the grate. It was from a typed letter. Only a few words remained unburned. I shouldn't have, but I read them. Sometimes," Miss Marple said kindly. "It's a housekeeper's duty to know more than she's told." It said, "Evidence regarding the child in question," and underneath, in smaller type, "Discretion assured." There was the name of a London firm, but it was mostly burned away. "Child in question." The phrase sent a small electric thrill through Miss Marple's orderly mind. Inheritance disputes, romantic entanglements, gambling debts. These were familiar motives. But illegitimacy, secret heirs, hidden adoptions, those were the sorts of buried scandals that could drive perfectly respectable people to the most desperate acts. That evening, as the village settled into a subdued quiet, another disturbance tore through the Hartwell household. Sarah, returning from a brief, furtive meeting with James Pemberton at the lane by the church, found her bedroom ransacked. Drawers had been pulled out, boxes opened, papers scattered. Nothing of obvious value was missing. Her jewelry lay untouched, her small savings untouched in their tin. But Sarah's face turned ashen as she clutched at a single empty space in her writing desk. A sealed envelope was gone, the one bearing her mother's handwriting, entrusted to her the previous week with the cryptic instruction: "If anything happens to me, my dear, this must go straight to the solicitors." Someone, it seemed, had decided that its contents must never be seen. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Graves gravely, her expression one of mild distress suitable to an elderly spinster confronted with unseemly family matters. Yet behind the soft oh dear, that escaped her lips. Her mind was working with a precision that would have startled those who knew her only as a knitter of baby garments. For charity. The hidden strong-box, the letters about the first marriage, James Pemberton's unsuspecting role as Mrs. Hartwell's son. These were not incidental details. They formed the dark heart of the tragedy, for if Mrs. Hartwell had discovered that Sarah and James were half-sister and brother, her violent opposition to their marriage became not merely controlling, but tragically necessary. And if Sarah or James had discovered the truth in turn, their world would have shattered. The next development came sooner than anyone expected. Late that same night, the peace of St. Mary Mead was broken by the urgent clatter of hooves and wheels on the lane. Miss Marple, who slept lightly, opened her curtains to see Dr. Spoor, Haydock's trap racing toward Willowmere House, lanterns swinging wildly. 10 minutes later, the vicar's bell rang frantically, summoning help. By morning, the village was humming with the news. Derek Hartwell had been found unconscious in his bedroom, an overturned bottle of sleeping draught on his bedside table and a note pinned neatly to his pillow. Inspector Slack stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded, while Dr. Haydock completed his examination. "He'll live," Haydock said shortly. It was a considerable dose, but not enough to kill an adult male. Clumsy attempt, if it was deliberate. If... Slack picked up the folded note with a gloved hand. "The man leaves a confession and swallows enough veronal to stun a horse. It looks very like remorse to me." Miss Marple, standing unobtrusively near the door, watched the inspector's face as he read aloud. "I can't endure the suspicion any longer. Mother's dead because of me. I drove her to desperation over the will, and when I realized what she meant to do, it was already too late. I might as well have killed her myself. There is no point in going on. Derek..." "It's not quite a confession of murder, is it?" Miss Marple observed mildly. "Rather an expression of guilt, which is a very different thing. One so often sees that when young men quarrel with their elders and tragedy follows." Slack frowned. "You think this was staged?" "I think," Miss Marple said, her eyes resting thoughtfully on the neat, even lines of the note, "that Mr. Derrick's handwriting is rather more angular. I happened to notice it on a check he signed for the church roof fund. This, on the other hand, is, if I am not mistaken, a feminine script." Slack swore under his breath. "You're suggesting someone forged a suicide note and tried to finish him off?" "Not very successfully," Miss Marple replied. "It suggests haste, or perhaps a desire to dramatize his supposed guilt rather than to ensure his death." At that moment, Sarah appeared in the doorway, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with genuine terror. Is Derek..." "He'll recover," Dr. Haydock said briskly. "But someone will need to watch him for the next 24 hours. Miss Marple watched Sarah with quiet intensity. The young woman's distress seemed real enough, yet when she caught sight of the suicide note in Inspector Slack's hand, there was a flicker, no more than a heartbeat of something, like satisfaction before the mask of anguish descended again. It was a very small thing, but Miss Marple had built entire solutions on less. Inspector Slack rose, the words of formal arrest already forming on his lips, but Miss Marple lifted one small gloved hand. "If you please, Inspector." "Not yet." Sarah's sobs faltered into bewildered silence. Derek stared at Miss Marple as though she had lost her senses. Even Dr. Haydock's rigid posture eased a fraction. "But you've just shown she had motive, opportunity, and the knowledge to use poison," Slack protested. "And she's as good as admitted." "No," Miss Marple said gently. "What Miss Sarah has admitted is despair, not murder. There is a very great difference." She turned to the girl. "You bought those photographic chemicals because you meant to frighten your mother, perhaps to take some yourself, just enough to make her believe you would rather die than give up your engagement. You never intended to kill her. You had not the hardness for that. You argued. She told you the truth about James, and your world collapsed. Sarah gazed at her, eyes wide and red-rimmed. I only wanted to make her afraid," she whispered. "I meant to pour it into my own sherry and faint dramatically. But I lost my nerve. I never used it. I swear I didn't." Inspector Slack gave an impatient snort. "Very moving, I'm sure. But the post-mortem—" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes very bright. "The post-mortem. Perhaps you would share the results, Inspector." Slack hesitated, then cleared his throat. "The analyst's report came this morning. Death due to a considerable quantity of pure potassium cyanide. No trace of any other compound." "Precisely." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, decisively. "Not photographic chemicals at all. The real poison came from elsewhere." She looked around the room, her gaze finally settling on Dr. Haydock. "From your parcel, Doctor. The one from the London laboratory, delivered 2 days before the party." Haydock gave a short, incredulous laugh. "You can't possibly consider—" Miss Marple went on, her tone mild. "Mrs. Hartwell discovers your gambling debts and threatens exposure. She ends your engagement and, being a determined woman, quite possibly plans to inform the medical council. Your career, your respectability, gone. You had far more to lose than anyone." Slack's eyes narrowed. "And you were first on the scene, first to touch the body, first to declare cyanide, before anyone mentioned the potting shed." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "A most impressive diagnosis. Too impressive for a man who had supposedly no reason to think of cyanide in particular." Haydock's face had become an ugly, mottled color. "I smelt it," he said hoarsely. "Any competent doctor—" "And you had the perfect opportunity," Miss Marple continued inexorably. "A private consultation that morning before the guests arrived. A glass of sherry to steady her nerves. You knew she often kept one by her desk. A few drops from your laboratory supply. Then you walked back across the garden looking rather relieved, I'm told." Derek inhaled sharply. "I saw you go into her," he burst out. "Around 3:30. I thought nothing of it." "After the scream," Miss Marple said softly. "You were the one who insisted the French doors must be broken, when the hall door could quite easily have been unlocked from the wind. Outside, if you hadn't locked it yourself when you left, to create your locked room puzzle." Slack stared. "Then the potting shed cyanide—" "A blind," Miss Marple said, the bottle disturbed after the fact, to suggest the source. "A little knowledge of gardening, a borrowed key, quite easy for a doctor often in and out of the house. And who better than a physician to know how very little cyanide is needed, and how swiftly it works?" Haydock looked from face to face, saw no ally, and sagged as though something inside him had snapped. "She was going to ruin me," he said in a flat, dead voice. "After everything I'd done for her, for this family. She said she would write that very afternoon, to the council, to my creditors. I only meant to frighten her, to make her ill, to gain time, but she drank it all." Miss Marple's voice, when she spoke, held no triumph, only a profound weariness. "You planned a 99% perfect murder, Doctor. You counted on family quarrels, on gossip, on that wretched will. You even counted on poor Sarah's foolish purchase to muddy the waters. But you forgot that in a village, little things are always noticed. Clean satin shoes on a muddy path, fresh ash in a fireplace, a diagnosis made a shade too quickly. Afterwards, when Dr. Haydock had been led away, and Sarah had been taken upstairs in a state of half-hysterical collapse, Miss Marple walked home through the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead. Life, in its determined English fashion, was already beginning to right itself. The grocer's boy cycled past with his deliveries. "Mrs. Price," Ridley conferred urgently with the postmistress at the corner. The vicar's wife discussed flowers for the funeral with Mrs. Finch. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was much the same everywhere. capable of great kindness and equally great folly, love corrupted by fear, self-preservation masquerading as the moral outrage. The murder at Willowmere had been, in its way, almost perfect, but perfection, she knew from long experience, was a dangerous ambition. It encouraged people to overlook the tiniest imperfection, the loose stitch, the crooked row that would, in the end, unravel everything. She let herself into a neat little cottage, set the kettle on, and took up her knitting once more. There would be other quarrels in St. Mary Mead, other small dramas and whispered secrets, but for the moment, the village settled back into its accustomed rhythms, outwardly unchanged, though beneath the surface, everyone would remember that even the most peaceful garden party might conceal the seeds of murder. In the weeks that followed Dr. Haydock's arrest, St. Mary Mead returned to its habitual rhythms with the stubborn resilience of English villages everywhere. The grocer continued to weigh out sugar with solemn care. The vicar preached on charity and the perils of judgment. Miss Price Ridley discussed the murder with such unflagging energy that one might have supposed she herself had solved it. Willowmere House, however, bore the subtle alterations that tragedy leaves in its wake. The blinds no longer remained ostentatiously open. Laughter was heard more rarely in the gardens. And Derek Hartwell, once the charmingly feckless stepson, was seen more often, walking alone by the river, pipe unlit, hands thrust deep in his pockets. It was there, one mild September afternoon, that Miss Marple encountered him. She had taken her knitting to the river path, ostensibly for the clear air's benefit, but in truth, to observe how the younger generation adjusted to calamity. "I suppose I ought to thank you, Miss Marple," Derek said abruptly, pausing beside her bench. "You cleared me after all. The village no longer looks at me as though I'd slipped cyanide into their tea." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I should hope not, Mr. Hartwell. You are quite foolish in some respects, but not at all the murderous sort. Murder requires a particular quality of coldness that you, whatever your faults, simply do not possess." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "High praise indeed. I'm ruined financially, of course. Mother's solicitor tells me the revised will stands. Most of Father's estate is tied up in trust for, of all people, James Pemberton." "Ah, yes," Miss Marple murmured, "the unintended beneficiary of so many missteps." Derek's expression softened unexpectedly. "Sarah's gone up north to stay with an aunt. She won't see James again, she says. She's determined not to tell him what she discovered, that they're related. It would only torment him, and there's no good to be had from it now." "That is very wise of her," Miss Marple said quietly. "Some truths, once revealed, do not set anyone free. They simply bind into new chains." He hesitated. "Do you really think Haydock meant it to be the perfect murder?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, watching her needles move with rhythmic precision, "that he believed himself cleverer than the ordinary run of humanity. Men in his position often do. A doctor sees much weakness, fear, pain, and comes to imagine himself superior to those who suffer. It is a very dangerous illusion." Derek gazed out over the river. "He very nearly got away with it." "Only nearly," Miss Marple corrected gently. 99%, perhaps. But it is the remaining 1% that always betrays them. Vanity, in his case. He could not resist displaying his expertise. Later that evening, Miss Marple received a visit from Inspector Slack. He stood awkwardly in her sitting room, hat in hand, as if uncertain how much gratitude one might reasonably offer to an elderly spinster who had outpaced the official police. "The Crown will have no trouble with this case," he said gruffly. "Between the chemical parcels, the gambling debts, Graves's statement, and your observations about the timing and the sherry, the evidence is quite damning." "The evidence was always there, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It merely needed someone to see it in the right order. People are like that too, you know. The same facts can make a saint or a villain of them, depending on how one arranges them." He regarded her with reluctant admiration. "I'll say this, Miss Marple. You see too much for comfort, but I'm damned glad you're on our side." When he left, taking the crisp evening air and the last formalities of the case with him. Miss Marple sat alone by her hearth, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. The village was quiet. The river murmured its eternal commentary on human folly outside her window. Murder, she reflected, was rarely monstrous in conception. It grew instead from very small seeds: hurt pride, desperate love, fear of disgrace. The Hartwell affair had contained all three, woven together as intricately as any lace pattern she had ever followed. And like lace, once stretched and fixed, the pattern would endure, its delicate beauty forever shadowed by the knowledge of how easily a single broken thread might have changed everything. The funeral of Mrs. Constance Hartwell was held on a clear, cool morning, the air sharp with the scent of late roses and damp earth. The villagers attended in their best black, not merely out of respect for the deceased, but for the irresistible pull of shared tragedy. In the front pew, Derek and Sarah sat side by side, a little older in spirit than the week before, listening as the vicar spoke gently of forgiveness, frailty, and the unknowable burdens others carry. Miss Marple watched them with quiet attention. Sarah's hand, gloved in black, lay still upon her lap, no longer clutching a handkerchief, no longer trembling. Derek's profile, once so arrogantly sure of its place in the world, had taken on something like humility. They exchanged a brief glance when the service ended, the kind of look that passes between people who have seen the edge of ruin and stepped back, chastened but still standing. Outside in the churchyard, little knots of villagers formed as they always did. Mrs. Price Ridley spoke in hushed tones with Mr. and Mrs. Clement, relating for the third time what she claimed Inspector Slack had confidentially revealed. Major Burnaby discussed Dr. Haydock's appearance in court, shaking his head in disbelief. Even now, some found it easier to blame the wrong crowd in London than to accept that their own respectable village doctor had deliberately planned murder. Miss Marple did not join their speculation. Instead, she lingered near the lich gate, watching as Derek and Sarah spoke briefly with Jan Pemberton, who had come down from London at short notice. There was kindness in his expression as he took Sarah's hand. Kindness tinged with confusion and hurt. Whatever explanation she had given him, it had been enough to end their engagement, but not enough to betray the deeper truth. Sarah left him with a small, sad smile and walked toward Miss Marple. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "not only for clearing Derek, but for leaving some things unsaid." "Some truths," Miss Marple replied, "do nothing but harm if spoken. Your mother carried that burden for many years out of love. It would be a pity to undo her efforts now that the danger has passed." Sarah swallowed. "I nearly killed her myself. That thought will never leave me." "You nearly did something terrible," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But when the moment came, you did not. That makes all the difference in the world, my dear. One can learn from wicked thoughts. One cannot so easily repair wicked deeds." Later that afternoon, back in her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her seat by the window with a fresh ball of pale grey wool. Outside, village life moved forward. Children chasing hoops along the lane, the postmistress cycling past with her satchel, the distant hum of voices from the high street. Murder, Miss Marple reflected, never truly left a place unchanged, yet the village would heal, absorbing this tragedy as it had others. Her thoughts drifted to Dr. Haydock, clever, capable, and done not by ignorance, but by vanity and fear. His plan had been devilishly well conceived, relying on his role, his knowledge, and the comfortable trust others placed in him. 99% perfect, she mused, and yet that final 1%, the unnecessary flourish of immediate diagnosis, the insistence on breaking the French doors, had betrayed him. Evil, in her long experience, rarely disguised itself as monstrous. It slipped in through smaller doors. A longing to keep one's reputation, a refusal to face disgrace, the quiet terror of losing the comfort one has come to take for granted. In that sense, Dr. Haydock was not so different from many others she had known, only a little more desperate and a little less scrupulous. Miss Marple smiled faintly and set her needles clicking once more. Patterns, whether in wool or in human conduct, always revealed themselves in time. All one needed was patience, careful observation, and the willingness to notice the tiny stitch that did not quite match. Once that was found, the rest, inevitably, would follow. And in said merry mead, life went on. Teapots were refilled, curtains were drawn at dusk, and in a small thatched cottage on the lane, an elderly lady continued to knit, to watch, and to understand far more than anyone ever guessed.